Gunjukwa, say water Yusia, Gina Galewe, Don Sira Wane Wilaro, Ne Singwaya Diso, O Hunda Galewe Dakwa, Arawena Hetsta. We give thanks to the Creator for this day that has been given to us, and for all of you that are gathered here for this occasion by way of technology, and for that we give thanks. We give thanks to the Creator for this day that has been given to us. We give thanks for you, the people, for Mother Earth, that we can still walk upon her, for all the waters. Water is life. For the many kinds of fish that purifies the water and gives us food. For the grasses and the many kinds of medicines. For the planted things and the roots and the many kinds of fruit. For the many insects and for all the different kinds of animals. For the trees that give us shade and give us fruit. For the birds with their beautiful songs. For the thunders. For the four winds, the four directions. For the sun that warms us by day, and the moon that shows us the way at night, and for the many stars, for the four beings, the angels that watch over us. And for all of this, we give thanks to Singwaya Diso, the Creator, who gave us all these things. And for this, we say, Nyawagoa, Danito. When I say Danito, that's like your amen. So be it.
So first of all, before I begin, I want to acknowledge and honor anyone in the room with us today who is a survivor or a intergenerational survivor of residential schools, and just take a moment for all of us to do that in our hearts and to hold them in our hearts as we do this work. They are at the center of it, and we need to never forget that. So as I said, thanks for having me. And what I'm going to talk to you about is the non-Indigenous United Church's journey of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. I want to be very clear that that's the perspective from which I'm speaking. What I'm going to share with you is a story of a very long relationship, and one that is now entering new territory, within which we all need to find our place. Many of you have probably participated in learning events like the Kairos Blanket exercise. I know there's some being offered next week for you, or you might have participated in events related to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You know that Indigenous peoples were present in, on, and caring for these lands long before European settlers and later other immigrants arrived. You know that there were relationships between Indigenous peoples and settlers, many of them codified in treaties, which were a form of sacred trust. And you know that as settler society's position in America solidified, as settlers became more grounded in what we call North America, and as settlers expanded westward, settler society decided it needed more and more land. And it ignored the intent of those treaties, of those sacred trusts. It developed policies and practices to displace Indigenous peoples from the land, and that included the creation of the Indian residential school system. So the United Church played a key role in Canada's Indian residential school system. This is a map of the schools that were covered by the settlement agreement, which is the legal agreement we deal with now in terms of the residential schools. The United Church played a key role in this system, which attempted to assimilate around 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children. In the 19th century, the Methodist and Presbyterian churches explicitly supported the goals of assimilation and Christianization that were a part of the residential school system. When they came together with other churches in 1925 to form the United Church of Canada, this new church carried on that commitment. And this school will be familiar to some of you. The first United Church residential school, or what we call the first United Church residential school, was Mount Elgin Industrial Institute, which opened in 1851. It was operated by the Wesleyan Methodist Society until Church Union in 1925, and then it was taken over by the new United Church's Board of Missions. The United Church ran another 14 Methodist and Presbyterian schools, primarily in the West. You can see this is a map that's available on one of our websites that shows Mount Elgin is down here, and everyone else is out west. And this is just a list of those schools by province. At any one point in time, the number in operation was between 13, so the highest operated at one time was 13, down to 4 that was in 1927, and down to 4 in 1966. So it's a long history. Now, the United Church is responsible for what happened to about 10% of all Indigenous children in the residential school system. And as you may have heard, but we're here to remember today, it's not a benign story. As the name implies, residential schools, children were removed from their communities, many of them hundreds of miles away. Some went to schools that were very close to their home communities. Others, it was very far away. Many did not return home for years. Survivors have recounted their experiences of cultural, physical, psychological, and sexual abuse at the schools. They lost their language, their connection to the family and the land, to their family and the land. And many, almost 4,000 in total, died. So the schools did not operate in isolation. They didn't just pop up out of nowhere. They emerged from a system of colonialism and racism that predated them by hundreds of years, and that continues today, almost 30 years after the last residential school closed. The church was and is very much a part of that system of colonization and racism. And we need to remember that, I'm a doctor because I'm a historian. We need to remember that colonialism is not just history. It is something that continues to run through our society. Now, the United Church didn't just establish or operate residential schools, it also established Indigenous communities of faith. And I'm just going to run through a series of slides showing you that those communities of faith still exist. And they were all around the residential schools. You'll remember that, or almost all around the residential schools. You'll remember that cluster out west, and you can see it here. So these are the Indigenous communities of faith operating today in British Columbia. Here we have Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario. There's a lot more than we may have realized, those of us who live here, and 2 in Quebec. And these Indigenous communities of faith have a really rich history, and that is that's part of the story of our relationship that needs to be reconciled. So I'll go into a little bit of that with you now. These pictures are taken in the community of Morley in Alberta. The picture on the left is the Reverend Dr. Chief John Snow Sr., and the picture on the right is his son, Tony, who's currently a candidate for ministry at Sandy Soto. John Snow Sr. created what was known as the Indian Ecumenical Conference. It was primarily an Indigenous gathering and took place every summer in Morley between 1971 and 1985. It really helped to shape much of Indigenous Christian spirituality in Canada at that time. And it also led to the United Church designating June 21st as National Indigenous Day of Prayer. John Snow's sons, Tony and John Jr., are now trying to bring back some of those teachings from the Indian Ecumenical Conference, and that's what you see happening in the picture at the right. So the point of showing this picture is to say there was rich theological, rich spiritual conversation happening in Indigenous communities of faith in the 1970s, at a time when we were barely past operating residential schools. We left our last school in 1969. Now, around the same time as this is happening, the United Church as a whole is beginning to engage in political solidarity with Indigenous peoples around land and treaty rights. And we did that primarily through Project North, which is now a part of Kairos. And so you had a couple of things happening. You had a couple of things coming to light. You saw the church as a whole looking at what I would say in quotation marks are external social justice issues that may have made the church begin to think, how have we participated in the denial of Indigenous rights? The ecumenical conferences, with their focus on Indigenous spirituality and Christian spirituality, may have helped highlight for the church its role in suppression of Indigenous culture and spirituality. This is the way events work in history. They play off against each other. And so coming out of that period in the 1970s, in 1977, you have the General Council deciding to review the nature of the church's work with Indigenous people. That's a fundamental shift to actually begin to look critically at the way we as a church have worked with Indigenous people. Interestingly, a year later, and marking the way for the future, I think the former Saskatchewan Conference approved a year of repentance. Within this context, Indigenous people in the church are continuing to organize and plot their own way forward. And in 1980, the first in a series of national Aboriginal consultations was held. These consultations were a really important part of the church, Indigenous church, reshaping itself and calling the church as a whole to account, looking at the history of its relationship, looking at the establishment of these Indigenous congregations alongside schools which oppressed, abused, and harmed people. The 80s saw a real focus on Indigenous theological education with the establishment of the BC Native Ministries Consortium at the Vancouver School of Theology and the Dr. Jesse Soto and the Francis Sandy Theological Centers. These two have since been merged and are known as the Sandy Soto Spiritual Center. So this is all beginning to ripple up in the 1980s. And in the national office, a division of Native Ministries was created. And it reported regularly to General Council Executive. In November of 1985, one of its members, Alberta Billy, who's the woman in the left on your screen, from Cape Mudge in BC, stood up and said that the United Church of Canada owed Indigenous peoples an apology for its role in colonization and destruction of language and culture. And this was not planned. This emerged organically. And I interviewed Alberta and moderator Bob Smith, who's on the right in this, on the 30th anniversary. And she said she still remembers that she said that. And Bob Smith just sort of said, "Oh God." And he said, "Did I say that?" And she said, "Yes, you did." And it was a lovely moment to watch these two kind of giants of this part of our history recollect the past together. At any rate, an apology wasn't offered immediately or swiftly. There was recognition that it needed to be thought through. And it did come at General Council in Sudbury in the summer of 1986. But I think it's really important for us to remember that it wasn't a foregone conclusion that it would happen. And that to this day, that apology is not considered complete. It is something that we are in the process of living out. Further developments in the church over the next few years resulted in the creation of the All Native Circle Conference in 1988. And ANCC, as it was known in 1988 at General Council, acknowledged the apology but didn't accept it. pointing out that there was still much work to be done to mend such a broken relationship. And the proof would be in the walking together towards that mend. Now, ANCC represented all of the Indigenous communities of faith in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, along with some in Ontario and Quebec. BC Ministries, communities of faith, they remained a part of BC Yukon Conference, and the remaining Ontario Quebec ministries stayed within their conferences, some of which were in the former conferences that you are in. But they also continued to meet together as Indigenous communities of faith. And in Ontario and Quebec, they have a very rich tradition of that union. In 2009, all of these bodies came together to create the Aboriginal Ministries Council, another step towards self-determination of the Indigenous Church. Meanwhile, the broader church's solidarity work continued. This included advocating for self-determination during the constitutional crisis of the 1980s, organizing around the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1993, and participating in other ecumenical campaigns for Aboriginal and treaty rights. So there was always happening this development of the Indigenous Church alongside, but separate from, non-Indigenous advocacy for Indigenous rights. And what was bubbling up underneath was the legacy of the residential schools. The church in the late 90s, early 2000s was finally challenged on its role in residential schools in a way that it couldn't ignore. This is Port Alberni Residential School on Vancouver Island. And this is the school that, in terms of the United Church, started everything. In 1997, former students of this school launched a lawsuit against the United Church and the Government of Canada, asking for compensation and damages for abuses committed by a dormitory supervisor. The local church, St. Andrew's, issued an apology to the students. And at the 36th General Council, there was a statement of repentance. Now, that didn't solve it. That's never going to solve it, right? Most of the former students ended up settling out of court, but the case, which was known as Blackwater, continued to move forward. And in June of 1998, both the church and the government were indeed found liable. The United Church appealed that decision, and there were several rounds in the courts. But by 2003, the liability was assessed by the courts as being Canada holding 75% responsibility for what happened, and the United Church holding 25%. So this established a precedent for other cases that could come forward, and other cases were coming forward. In June of 1998, the General Council Executive created what was called the Residential Schools Steering Committee. And this is really important in understanding how the United Church eventually, I will say, handled the residential schools crisis. The steering committee was composed of residential school survivors. It wasn't church bureaucrats. It was residential school survivors who were advising the church on how to respond to litigation, to the litigation they were facing, these thousands of lawsuits. Not just the legal questions about the case, but also pastoral questions and questions about the education of the wider church into its role in residential schools. In October 1998, the General Council Executive issued a formal apology to residential schools, to residential students, their families, and communities. And that was a huge turning point. I remember that turning point. I had just started working in the ecumenical community, and everyone was worried. Well, many of you will remember it too. What will this do to the church? We've admitted guilt. Will that bankrupt us? And those of us who were working in the ecumenical coalitions, who kind of flew by the seat of their pants most of the time anyway, we faced the very real reality that that it could all end for us, that all that justice work that we worked for could go. And I remember there was a gathering of all of the staff once, and we were sort of talking about this and what it meant. And I don't remember who it was, but one of our colleagues said, well, if that's the way we go down, that's the right way to go down. That's the ultimate social justice solution, is actually dealing with the wrongdoings that you've done institutionally. At any rate, that is not what happened, and we'll learn a bit more about that in a few minutes. But as negotiations continued around how we were going to deal with lawsuits, the steering committee adopted a list of principles to guide how we would respond. And this is what I meant when I said the steering committee wasn't just about legal advice, it was about holistic advice. And it identified 6 principles of reconciliation. It said that the work we were doing around reconciliation had to be rooted in an anti-racist and decolonizing position, that we had to acknowledge the presence of racism and colonialism in the church, and we had to commit to dismantling them. So this is remembered almost 20 years ago, these principles were named. We had to have a holistic understanding of abuse. It wasn't just physical abuse, it was numerous kinds of abuse, and that it affected not just the individual who attended school, but their family, their relations. There had to be the full participation of Indigenous peoples in the solutions. Whatever we were going to do to respond, Indigenous people had to be fully involved in that. The entire community that survivors came from had to be involved in reconciliation and in healing. It wasn't about individuals, it was about the impact on the whole community. There needed to be healing for Indigenous people who had gone through residential schools or felt their effects, and there needed to be education for non-Indigenous people about what their role was in it. And there had to be something looking forward, and that became the building right relations focus that the church took on. So as these principles are being defined, remember there's still a whole stack of lawsuits in the background. One of the former staff who worked on this said to me that he walked into to one of our legal, one of the lawyers' offices who was handling them, and he said they were stacks like this, and he held his hands up really, really high. Stacks like this all along the shelves of her office, because there were literally thousands of cases. So the United Church, the Roman Catholic religious orders, the Presbyterian Church, and the Anglican Church, they're all facing these lawsuits, and so is Canada. At some point, it was not a good relationship between them, but at some point, there was a realization that there needed to be a common approach to these, that there needed to be a resolution and there needed to be a common approach. And so negotiations were entered into for a comprehensive settlement agreement. And that was the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement that came into effect in October of 2007, but was agreed to, or was begun in May of 2006. And that is the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history. Now, the settlement agreement had what are known as 5 pillars, and I don't have them here. I'll tell you what they are, sorry. The 5, I had a slide in an old version of this and I removed it. It had 5 pillars. One was the common experience payment. So that was money that was awarded to students who attended residential schools, and it was meant to cover loss of culture and language. And it was based on how long they were in a school or in schools. And that was a standard figure that was just assessed. There was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which we'll talk more about later. There's Commemoration, which was the building of memorials to residential schools in communities. The Mount Elgin Memorial, which many of you have probably visited, would be an example of that. There was a National Healing Fund, which was to help deal with language and culture loss. So that's in addition to the healing funds that the churches already had established themselves. And there was the independent assessment process, which is the place where people went into hearings, separate hearings, to discuss what had happened to them in terms of physical, sexual, or psychological abuse. And that was a very difficult program for people to go through, as you can imagine. One of the things that the United Church did with respect to the independent assessment process was they trained people to be accompaniers there. If people who were giving their testimony wanted there to be a representative of the church that was responsible, if they wanted them present to hear it, then we trained over 300 people to do that. And many people did not want that, but some people did. And I think that was an important contribution that we made. There was lots of stuff about the residential schools agreement that was good. I mean, it got stuff that survivors wanted that they wouldn't have gotten any other way. But there were also things within it that didn't go well. A lot of trauma and pain resulted from the independent assessment process in particular. But I think the big thing that I want to leave you with about the settlement agreement is that it never would have happened without the pressure initiated by Indigenous survivors of residential schools. The churches and the governments would not have been moved to take responsibility if there had not been those lawsuits. And I think it's also accurate to say that the United Church's apologies wouldn't have happened without the actions of Indigenous people. There's a lot of agency there that we need to remember. And it's also important for us to remember, those of us who are non-Indigenous, that at different points in the process, the United Church denied the depth of what it was responsible for, as did the others. It was a process of acceptance. It wasn't an aha moment. During this time, and led by the Survivor Committee, the Living into Right Relations Network was built as a way to bring Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples together to work towards reconciliation. And that included a lot of education work, relationship building, and especially really broad and deep participation in Truth and Reconciliation Commission events, such as local hearings, regional hearings, and national events. And through that time, through dialogue, because we were working together towards reconciliation, a number of important changes were made. And they may appear symbolic, but actually they are things that began to redefine the identity of the church. This is one of them, the new Crest. In 2009, the 40th General Council approved the motion to acknowledge the presence and spirituality of Aboriginal peoples as a significant component to the basis of union. And it said that we needed a new crest to acknowledge the presence and spirituality of Aboriginal people in the United Church, to say that we have always been together in this church. Not always well, but we have always been together. And by 2012, the crest was changed to include the colors of the four directions and the Mohawk language phrase "for all my relations," another way of saying that all may be one. The chair of the Aboriginal Ministries Council, Ray Jones, and the moderator, Marty Tyndall, signed a covenant acknowledging the need for an ongoing relationship, rejecting historical attitudes, and affirming the commitment to move together. So those three things, changes to additional text to the basis of union, a new crest, and a covenant. By 2012, we're saying we're moving differently together now as a church. Also in 2012, the church renounced the doctrine of discovery, which is really a theological framework for colonization. And in 2015, at the request of the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, publicly affirmed Indigenous spirituality, which I think Indigenous people who were participating in the TRC really actually needed to hear. They needed not just to tell stories of their pain, but they actually needed to hear churches say, "We respect your spirituality." I want to go back to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission now, which, as I mentioned earlier, was a key component of the settlement agreement. And the TRC ran between 2007 and 2015, and it spent 6 years traveling across the country, hearing from more than 6,500 witnesses at local, regional, and regional events and 7 national events. And I imagine that former Commissioner and Senator Sinclair will tell you some about that when you meet with him on the 28th. Its goals were to record and honor the experiences of those who attended residential schools as children, to engage all Canadians in understanding the experience and its ongoing legacy, and to provide the country with a means of getting beyond the colonialism at the root of this, and to build a new relationship. So its goals were very much like the principles of reconciliation, which were identified by survivors in our residential school steering committee. And it's not surprising that they're similar, because these goals would have also been named by survivors. The United Church participated fully in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and when its 94 calls to action were released in June of 2015, we accepted them immediately. Then later in the year, the final report of the commission was released, 6 volumes, and we accepted that, and the indictment of the churches within it. Now, one of the central calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is around the UN declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples, which calls on governments, churches, and industry to adopt the declaration as the framework for reconciliation. We have identified the principles, rights, and principles, norms, and standards of the declaration to be these: the right to self-determination, the right to participate in decision-making, the right to lands and resources, the right to free, prior, and informed consent, right to spiritual identity, and the right to be free from discrimination. And again, you'll see lots of resonance between these and other principles that you've seen articulated around reconciliation. So like the other churches who were named as parties, we did this in 2016. We adopted the declaration, and it had implications for what we do as a church, everything we do as a church, how we do it. And it has implications, or it had implications, for the way we're structured. So at General Council 42, the church decided that it would move to a 3-court model. The Indigenous church stood up and said, we're not ready for that. We haven't gone through the process that the rest of the church has gone through in the remit, and we have our own ways of doing things. We want more time to see how we want to be shaped as a church. So they weren't ready to move into the new structure, and they needed time to figure out their own future, rooted in their own history, spirituality, stories, and ways of doing things. And so this is some of the group, not all of the group. The Aboriginal Ministries Council created a group from across the church, the Indigenous church, called the Caretakers of Our Indigenous Circle. And you can tell that they were meeting on September 30th because everyone's wearing an orange shirt to honor residential school students. The caretakers' task was to create a vision of what a self-determining Indigenous church would look like. The result of those deliberations is the calls to the church, which is rooted very deeply in Indigenous knowledge, experience, and the UN Declaration. We're not going to go into it in any depth here. That can be done another time. But these are the principles: that it would have its own office of vocation, that it would to accompany ministry personnel, that it would accompany and provide oversight for Indigenous ministry formation, that it would oversee ministry placement in Indigenous communities of faith, that there would be an Indigenous testamer that would be required before anyone could offer ministry in an Indigenous setting, that there would be a new national Indigenous organization, National Indigenous Church, that there would be an opportunity for different ways to belong to the church. You could belong to the National Indigenous Organization, you could belong to a region, you could belong to both. There were principles about leadership and consensus building that are a bit different to the way we do it in the non-Indigenous church. There was the notion of sustainable support. How would we ensure that the Indigenous church could move forward? And there was support for sexual orientation and diversity within Indigenous communities. And that was a new piece for the Indigenous church. It underwent wide consultation and was accepted as the blueprint for a new structure at the National Indigenous Spiritual Gathering in 2019. And at that gathering, there was a new Indigenous Council elected as well, and here they are, and a National Indigenous Elders Council was selected. So the elders and the council are currently still working to map out the church's future. And the rest of the church, I think, is learning bit by bit how to walk alongside this, because we have lots of old relationships, but in many ways we're doing things differently. And that takes time. So where are we? I think we're at a place where the church, in the church at least, we really have the opportunity to be a church that is rooted in reconciliation. It's something we've been trying to move towards for more than 30 years. And now with this new structure, we have that possibility. Some questions that we are exploring as a church include these. How will we be in relationship as two distinct parts of the church? When will we come together? When will we do things separately? How will we address the question of resources, including reparative justice and land return? In other words, reparations. I know someone who's in the audience today listed that as something they were interested in learning about. And how will our commitment to be an anti-racist church affect this relationship? These are big questions for us. That's sort of where we are as a church. Nationally, I think we're at a place, and I bet you Senator Sinclair will talk about this, where there's some serious reconciliation fatigue, particularly in light of ongoing racism and violence directed at Indigenous peoples, continuing water advisories and inadequate housing in Indigenous communities, and continued denial of treaty and Indigenous rights. And so we need to continue as a church to advocate in those areas as well. I just wanted to give you a final update on where we are with some key calls to action. The first one is government adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Like the churches and industry, governments have been called to adopt the UN Declaration as the framework for reconciliation. One provincial government has adopted it, that's British Columbia, and the federal government has initiated legislation to do this. And I know this also came up in things you were interested in, and that is Bill C-15. Now, as a church, our own position on UNDRIP, meaning that it's Indigenous peoples who participate in decision-making on those kinds of pieces of legislation, means that our response to Bill C-15 is informed by the National Indigenous Council. And we did have some good discussions with the council about what they thought of Bill C-15. And their decision, and it's on the website, is to neither support nor oppose the bill, mostly because it had concerns about the consultation process that led to the bill. But recognizing that this bill is a framework that is likely to move forward, it has called on the government to work more collaboratively and in more genuine partnership as the bill is implemented. So it said, we're not going to enter into yes or no on the bill. We can see where it's going. We weren't happy about how it came about, but if you really mean what you say, as you implement it, you will take deeper, broader consultation, because that is the way we make decisions as Indigenous people. So that's where we are on the UN Declaration right now. There's also the Covenant of Reconciliation, Call to Action 46, which calls on all parties to the settlement agreement to reject doctrines of colonization, such as doctrine of discovery, which we already have, terra nullius, to really work from the framework of the UN Declaration in everything we do, but to explicitly renounce these doctrines and lift up others in our work. That work is underway. That work started in February of 2020. And you can understand why it's not getting anywhere, because it's the kind of work, I shouldn't say it's not getting anywhere. There is a lot of work being done on a draft that needs to go into consultation and community. The problem is we can't go into consultation and community when we're in a lockdown. So we had a beautiful, beautiful plan to do that work through 2020. Which was put on hold, but I want you to know that that's still continuing, and it will come back at some point to the church. It will come back to the Indigenous church, and it will come back to the church as a whole, because we are in covenant together to discuss what that covenant should look like, what it should say, and how we should implement it. So please be aware of that for the coming months. And I don't know if Senator Sinclair will be aware of that or not. Former Commissioner Marie Wilson is. I don't know if she's shared that news with him or not. There's also a number of calls to action that we're named in relating to commemorating this period in our life as a nation, period of residential schools, and memorializing those who were most affected by it. This goes from maintaining a list of names of children who died, to identifying and preserving burial sites according to community wishes, to building provincial and national memorials. None of those are complete, but most are underway. There's been some initial talk about, well, more than initial, there's a plan put forward for a national memorial in Ottawa. There's significant work done on a memorial in Toronto for the province of Ontario. There is a memorial list of names at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. And so that stuff is happening. Our role as a church there is not to be right in among it. That is work of the community, work of survivors. Our role is to provide access to any information we have access to, and to support community wishes and decisions. In some communities, there are going to be Indigenous communities of faith who will be affected. And we want to make sure that we're there in a way that they want us to be, if they want us to be. So that's kind of a back and forth tale of our relationship with each other, and where we are in the reconciliation journey. And I want to go back to the 1986 apology. The most powerful words in that for me are the ones you see on your screen. We are not what we are meant by God to be. My question to you now, in light of this story of our relationship, is what are we meant by God to be, and how might we become so? So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. You have given us a lot to think about, a lot to digest, a lot to pray about. Thank you for continuing to do this work on behalf of the church, because it is something that we settler peoples in the church need to know and acknowledge. So thank you. And we open the floor for questions.
There's a question around the 2003 court case. It's not a Supreme Court case. It would have been a Superior Court case. I don't know the exact. But it was specifically around the Blackwater case, which dealt with the United Church School. So it said the government of Canada was responsible for 75% of the liability in that school because it had most responsibility for ownership and running of the school and setting policy in the school. And the United Churches was 25%. But that then became a template that could be used elsewhere. So that became clear that would be, I would say, the minimum of how it would be defined. In the chat from Brad, the question gets me thinking about my inherited assumptions about who gets to decide what God meant us to be and the process for discerning that. Yeah, I think that's maybe why I asked the question. Yeah.
Sarah, I'm going to ask you if you can restate that question.
I took a phrase from the 1986 apology where the abuse or the role in colonization is named, and it's articulated how the relationship is broken. We are not what we are meant by God to be. And I said, in light of what we've talked about this morning, what do you think we are meant by God to be, and how might we become so? If that was a call given to us by our leadership 35 years ago this summer, how might we respond to that now? Someone's pointing out recent Broadview article around the Blackwater case.
Hmm.
Lots of resources out there. Can you clarify why the UCC's commitment to be an anti-racist church is a concern? That's a very well-worded question. I didn't mean it that it was a concern. I just meant how would we reflect our anti-racism commitment in our relationship back to the circle? But thank you for asking that question, because if it's not that they're concerned about us being anti-racist, it's how do we live that out? Because I think one of the difficult things is many of us as non-Indigenous people find it difficult to look at relationships with Indigenous people, and this is my personal opinion here, as being relationships of racism. I think growing up as I did in the 1970s and 1980s, I thought, and I think many of my contemporaries thought, I'm Canadian, I'm not racist. And I could look to the States and say, we don't have racism. Now, granted, I also grew up in Newfoundland, which was really super, super white. But we don't have racism. Look what they have in the States. We don't have that. And I think that was obviously a wrong assumption. But I also think we tended to look at our relationship with Indigenous peoples as somehow different. Like it wasn't racist, it was just different. And I think that in part, we don't want to, or we find it difficult to admit that, because those of us who are from the settler stock maybe don't understand our position as what I call, not just me, but others call settler colonials, that we continue to carry the benefits of the disposition that our forebears created. You know, I work in a church that's built on Indigenous land, right? I went to school and universities that were on Indigenous. All of these benefits accrued to me because of what my forebears did. And it's kind of hard to admit your role in a colonial and racist society. You want to say that wasn't me, I didn't do that. And I hear that a lot in this work. And so I think part of the work that we have to do is begin to dismantle that. Those of us who are from that settler colonial tradition, how do we address our role in colonization and the past and the future? Because it all, as I said earlier, it all ripples into the future. And I just want to share with you this book, Healing Haunted Histories by Ched Myers and Elaine Enns. And it's exactly about that. The subtitle is A Settler Discipleship of Decolonization. Ched and Elaine are friends of mine, and I've been working with them for years on various things, including this very notion of settler decolonization. I recommend this book if you want to get a hold of it. I've tried to get it into UCRD. I'll try again. It encourages you to explore your role in history and what that means. And I also have a workshop that I facilitate on that if there's any interest in it, I'd be happy to talk to folks about, and we could do that. Yes, Diane, Healing Haunted Histories. Yeah.
And can you tell me the author? I'm just typing it into the chat.
Yeah, Ched Myers and Elaine Enns. Actually, it's Elaine Enns is the primary author. ENNS.
Doing both decolonizing work and anti-racism work, is there enough capacity for us to do both? Yeah,
I think that is a question, and Adele Halliday and I will soon find out if there is, because we are trying to do those together, and there are points of confluence, right? I mean, something like the doctrine of discovery is essential to both of those pieces. So they're one of my favorite phrases: two halves of the same walnut, really. We're not going to break apart racism in this country if we don't also break apart colonization. I don't think. how can we explain that Ontario had only one residential school today and there are, that's a really good question, Isaac. I don't have the wisdom on that. And so there was one school in Southern Ontario. Yet there are these churches all up Western Ontario. I think that might be a project to look into. And it could be a case of children came from all those communities to Mount Elgin, and churches were planted in the communities that they came from. It could be that geographically, when those when the white communities were formed in areas like up the Bruce Peninsula and so on, that they didn't plant a school, but they planted churches. Like, it was still part of the conversion piece. I'll try and do some research on that. I appreciate that question. Yeah, lots of Methodist missionary work. Yeah, there were other residential schools up there. That is true. I think the interesting note, though, is that generally our Indigenous communities of faith tend to be where our schools were, and we didn't have school there. But yeah. Yeah, we all have connections to these places, right? This is part of see, Brad, what you're doing there is looking at your family history in light of your connections to colonialism, right? And teasing out the pieces. Yeah, school in Brantford, Anglican school in Brantford. So there's a nice point of connection between the decolonization work and the anti-racism work that Meredith is pointing out. The way the church sort of embraced both these groups of people and oppressed both these groups of people. And yet these communities remain. And I think there are some of these similar kinds of conversations happening, right? Obviously, there are these similar kinds of questions happening in the Black church around inequity and reparations and all of those sorts of things. There, I think we may be at the end of our questions.
I was just going to lift up Sarah. I was going back in the chat and I found it was framed as a statement, but I'd like to reform it as a question. Lots of our communities of faith are in a place now where they are regularly acknowledging the territory when they gather. How do we move it from just naming peoples and treaties and unceded territories to a place where it means something more, to a place that that helps us work towards our ultimate goal of reconciliation?
That's an excellent question. I'm glad you found that. And I think Therese was trying to model some of that in the way she did the land acknowledgement when we started, acknowledging the people who have historically been here, acknowledging the Indigenous people who are here now and whatever treaties are there, but also asking what is our role in asking the active question of how do I enter into the spirit of that treaty? How do I enter into relationship with those people? How do I treat the land? So that it's not just saying this is what I do. This is who was here, because that also places it just in the past. That makes it a thing of the past. There are people here now, and so when I do mine, I always I actually tend towards naming who is here now, because that's who I have the opportunity to be in relationship with. So I think it's a matter of asking questions of what your responsibilities are. If there's a treaty, what's your responsibility as a partner in that treaty, and how will you live it out? So those kinds of active questions. Can I explain the UN Declaration and where it stands? Yes. So the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is, and we have these little books that you can order actually, from UCRD if you want. They're free. You only have to pay postage. And it contains the text of the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action and the text of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So the UN Declaration was adopted by the UN in 2007, and 4 countries abstained: Canada, US, New Zealand, and Australia. And they abstained primarily because they were afraid of the right of consent, a free, prior, and informed consent that it gave to Indigenous peoples, which could be seen to impede resource development. Anyway, there was a lot of concern that this document gave Indigenous peoples new rights, and it doesn't do that. It is basically a codification of rights that have been acknowledged for Indigenous peoples over the last 30 years. It puts them all together in one document and says, here they all are, and you need to be aware of them. And you need to when you make decisions in your countries, you need to do it according to, this needs to be factored in. So Canada really resisted it for a long time. The churches were a big part of pressuring Canada to adopt it. And in 2010, the Harper government did adopt it. I still remember the day. It was a Friday afternoon, and a news release came out saying basically that Canada is no longer opposing the declaration. And we were all, they're doing this on Friday afternoon because they don't want anyone to know it, because they don't really believe it. So Canada said that in 2010 and then really didn't do anything. And then when Trudeau was elected in 2015, he said that they would implement it, but it was very, very slow. And it wasn't until 2016 that they actually went to the UN and said, yes, we accept the declaration and we will implement it fully. It's not yet been implemented. There needs to be some laws put in place. And so there had been a private members bill, Bill C-262, which was designed to do that, which the government opposed for a long time, but then finally came on board with. And but it died in the Senate in 2019 when we were going to an election. And now there is a new bill, Bill C-15, that the government has put forward and is really pushing to get through before it ends up in an election. And the bill will probably pass. Incidentally, if you have access to the Globe and Mail, there was an excellent article about what this bill will and won't achieve by Judy Wilson-Raybould, the former Justice Minister for the Trudeau government. It's a great article. It was in Saturday's edition. So if you have access to that, please look that up. It was a terrific piece of work saying this is a small thing. It's not going to solve everything, but it should be passed. It's a good thing. Again, I'm not saying that from a United Church position because we don't have a position on it, but that's what's out there.
Fred Monteith has a question. As we close churches, is there consideration of consulting with Indigenous communities about the land on which we sit?
Yes. So we are actually working on a document that will help communities of faith and the regions have those conversations about what happens to the land. And if there's a decision that you want to return the land, how to do that. Because it's not straightforward. You can't just say, I give this deed of land to this First Nation. So we are working on that. Because it has been done, right? It was done in Antler River, right? So it can be done. Anyway, to finish off on the bill, it's not yet in Canadian law, but it probably will be before the House rises this summer. I wonder if the geography of Ontario contributed more to day schools. Yeah, that's probably true, Cheryl Ann. That's a good point. We operated a lot of day schools as well.
Susan has a family document that she's wondering about whether it could be part of a personal reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples. Any suggestions on how to move forward on something like that?
Well, I guess I would ask if, what kind of relationship? Do you have any kind of relationship where you could bring that forward and say, can we talk about this? I think just sort of approaching with that would have to come after, I think, a period of relationship building.
Mhm.
If I'm understanding what you're asking. I mean, that's a phenomenal document to have. You might want to explore it a bit more. In the States, many denominations are split between a black and a white church. Do you think this is what's happening? No, I don't think. I think. I hope that one of the things you got from what I was saying was that there always was a strong Indigenous church in the United Church. I don't think we always saw it. For years, for example, I thought the entire Indigenous church was all Native Circle Conference. And when I came to the United Church to work, and I was working with some colleagues in another unit about something, and I said, oh, well, we're going to have to go to, they said, we're going to have to go to ANCC about that, right? And I said, yeah, and BC Native Ministries in Ontario, Quebec. And they were like, what? Because we haven't seen that church. And so now we're being asked to see it. I think it's a good question, but I think that is more the reality. Yes, Cheryl Ann has put in here about disbanding congregations and a portion of proceeds being dedicated to Indigenous ministries and justice. And there is a trust fund that is holding those gifts. And every conference, I think, region, most regions have these. I think there's 2 regions that are still discerning how they're going to do it, but they are working towards it.
Well, I think we're getting close to our time to end. So thank you again, Sarah, for your time and your sharing of the knowledge and wisdom that you've amassed over the years, and for calling us all to greater knowledge and commitment to right relations.
Well, thank you all for showing up. Thank you for having me, and we'll move forward together.
And I would like to turn it over to our elder. Thank you again, Norma, for being present with us. And I would invite you, Norma, to close us in this time together.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Since we're talking about residential schools, I'm going to leave this with you before I do the closing. I did not attend a residential school. I have attended seminars on residential schools, and I have listened to the survivors that have been there. I hear about 5- and 6-year-olds going to the school and not coming out until they were teenagers. They could stay there until they were 16. Once they reached their 16th birthday, they were put out of the school, and some with no other place to go. I hear about the loneliness and the feeling of abandonment and despair. I've tried to capture that feeling with this poem that came to me in the night, and I wrote it down before I forgot the words. This could be a girl or a boy waiting for mom, dad, or an auntie or a grandparent to come. And I just called it, I Wait. I stand by the window and wait. I stand and look toward the gate. I wait and wait and wait. I watch for that person to come through the gate. I sat on the chair and they cut my hair. My braids fall on the floor that is bare. I sat on the chair and I wait. I wait for that person to come through the gate. I go to the fall fair. I stand and look and stare. I wait for the person to come through that gate. I see the pop and the taffy. I long for a taste of the fair. I long for that person to come, and I wait for that person to come through the gate. I'm older now, and soon I will leave. Soon I will pass through the gate. I pass the window and briefly stare. I know that the person so long I await will never come through the gate. And I wrote that after attending a seminar on April the 9th, 2001. And I'll do my closing. Nyala Singwaya Diso. We give thanks to the Creator for this day and for the time that we have spent together, for the discussions we have had, and for the sharing, and for the lessons we have learned. We also think of all the people who are sick with the virus, and may Creator be with them and us as we continue on. We have reached the point where all the words have been spoken. Now it is time for us to be or to go in the four directions. For now, we say, Onegewahi, Gunalukwa. Until we meet again, we care. Donito.
Thank you, Norma.
Nawa Gola, many thanks.